In this lecture, we are going to learn how we can work with floating point numbers. That means the numbers with some decimal points. So we have learned that floating point numbers are stored in double or decimal type in MongoDB. And by default, when we use Mongo shell, there all the numbers are treated as double type. So when we pass a number from Mongo shell to MongoDB server, there that number will be stored in double data type. So when you pass a number to MongoDB with or without decimal, it will always be saved as double type. Now in this lecture, let's understand how the double type, which has less precision, works, and what is the problem with double type and how we can overcome that problem using decimal type. Let's go to Mongo shell. Currently, I'm in the sample DB database. What I'm going to do is, in the sample DB database, I have this test collection. So I'm going to delete all the documents from this test collection and we will start fresh. So I'm going to delete all the documents. You can see 2 documents has been deleted. Let's clear the shell. And now let's go ahead and let's insert a new document in this test collection. For that, I'm going to use insert one method. And in this document, I'm going to have 2 properties, num1, let's say 0.1. I'm assigning a decimal value to this num1. And I'm also going to have num2, to which I'm going to assign 0.3. So both num1 and num2 is going to store a floating point number. And by default, it will be treated as double type. It will be stored as double type in MongoDB server. Now, if I go ahead and if I create this document, so it says insert one is not a function. That's correct because here this O should be in uppercase. So now the document has been inserted. If we go ahead and if we query this test collection now, everything looks good. We have this num1 with 0.1, num2 with 0.3. Now remember that this 0.1 and this 0.3, it is saved in double data type. And we have learned that in double data type, we might have some imprecision. So for example, the 0.1, it might be saved as 0.1 with some trailing zeros and then some imprecision like this. In the same way, 0.3 might have been saved as 0.3 with some trailing zeros and then some imprecision. Okay. So here in the result, it looks like everything is saved as it should be. Num1 is storing 0.1 and num2 is storing 0.3. But that is not the case. As I mentioned, since these values are stored in double type, there might be some imprecision in storing these values. And we can see the difference when we do some calculation with these 2 decimal values. So for example, let's say I want to subtract num1 from num2. For that, on the test collection, I'm going to use aggregation pipeline. In this aggregation pipeline, I'm going to use a single stage called $project. So I need to wrap it within curly braces. So let's use $project. And what do we want to project here? Let's say I want to project a field called result. And what should be the result? Result should be the subtraction of num1 from num2. So here I'm going to use the subtract operator. And what do we want to subtract? We want to subtract num1 from num2. So first I'll specify num1, and since it is a field name, we need to use dollar. So I can say dollar num1, and then the second element here will be num2. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's run this command. And here we have an error. Okay, it should be aggregate and not aggregation. If I run this command now, you will see that the result is 0.199999 and at the end 8. Ideally, the result should have been 0.2 because when we subtract 0.1 from 0.3, the result should be 0.2. But that is not the case here. The result is almost 0.2, but it is not exactly 0.2. And the reason why we don't have the result as 0.2 here is because, as I mentioned, when these decimal numbers will be stored, they will have some imprecision. And because of that imprecision, we have this result. We don't have the exact result, we have almost the result value. And as I mentioned, this is because the double values are not stored exactly as we pass it. Instead, it will have some imprecision added to it. So when we set num1 to 0.1, It is possible that num1 will have been assigned with 0.1 with some trailing zeros and then some impurity, some imprecision value, something like this. And because of this, we have received this type of result. And that's what we learned about double type. Double types does not have very high precision. So if you want to store a floating point number where the precision does not matter, you can simply go ahead and use double type. But if you want to store floating point numbers with high precision because you're doing some scientific calculations or because you're building a financial application, there the precision is very important. And there you might want to have a very high precision while saving floating point numbers. And for that, you can use decimal data type. So instead of storing this 0.1 and 0.3 in double data type for num1 and num2, let's say I want to store it in decimal data type in MongoDB. For that, what we can do is, first of all, let me go ahead and let me clear the shell. And let me also go ahead and let me delete the document from this test collection. And now let's go ahead and let's insert the document again. Okay, but this time I'm not going to store these floating point numbers in double data type. Instead, I want to store it in decimal data type. So for that, we have another method called number decimal. And we can pass this floating point number to this number decimal like this. And we will pass it as a string value because as we have learned, the double value will have some imprecision. So when we are converting that double value to decimal, those imprecision will also be taken into account. But we want to avoid that. And that's why here we have wrapped it in single quotes to make it as a string value. And from this string, this number decimal will extract the floating point number and it will convert it to decimal type. And when we are storing this 0.1 as a string value, it will not have any imprecisions added to it. So this 0.1, it will be exactly converted to decimal type. But if we don't specify it as a string value, it will be treated as double. That double will have some imprecision. And when it will be converted to decimal type, that imprecision will also be taken into account. In the same way, we also want to convert this 0.3 to decimal type. So again, we are going to use number decimal and we are going to pass this 0.3 as a string value to number decimal. Okay, so now in the MongoDB database, this 0.1 and 0.3, it will be stored as decimal values and not double values. And we have learned that decimal values have very high precision. Let me go ahead and let me insert this document. So the document has been inserted. Let's go ahead and let's query it. You can see that these values are stored as decimal 128-bit. So these values are no more a double value. They're stored as decimals. And now let's go ahead and let's perform the calculation. So again, I'm going to use the aggregation pipeline. And there I'm going to subtract the value of field num1 from the value of field num2. And if I go ahead and if I run this command, you will see that the result is minus 0.2, which is correct. But my intention was to subtract num1 from num2. But here we have subtracted num2 from num1. So here let me change it to num2 and let me change this field name to num1. Okay, basically I want to subtract num1, the value stored in this num1 field, from num2 field, and the result should be 0.2. So if I go ahead and if I press enter, now you will see that the result is 0.2, which is correct. Now there is one more thing I want to cover here, and that is, let's say I want to update this document in the test collection. So for that I'm going to use update one. There, let me pass a filter object which will be empty. Here we have only one document, so that document will be returned. And in there, let's say I want to increment the value from 0.2 to 0.3. So for that, again, we can use $inc operator. And what do we want to increment here? We want to increment the value of num1 from 0.1 to 0.2. So here I want to increment num1 and I want to increment it by 0.1. Now remember that num1 is storing a decimal value and this 0.1, it will be treated as double. So when you are going to increment the decimal value by 0.1, which is a double, remember that that double will also have some imprecision. So when the decimal value will be incremented by 0.1, with that, it is also going to add the imprecision to that decimal value. And that's why whenever you want to perform any arithmetic operation with a floating point number, you must convert it to appropriate type. In this case, before incrementing the value of num1 by 0.1, first I'm going to convert this 0.1 to decimal type. So for that, we have learned how we can do that. We can use number decimal. We will pass this 0.1 as a string value to this number decimal, so that if there is any imprecision which will be added to 0.1, that will not be added when we pass it as string value. And now the 0.1 without any imprecision will be added to this 0.1, and the result will be a decimal with high precision. I hope you got my point. So if I run this command, and here we have an error, and the error is because here we don't need to use this dollar sign. We can simply specify the field name. And now if I go ahead and if I press enter, the document has been modified. And if we query the collection, they will see that the value has incremented to 0.2 and it is still decimal. Okay, but if I go ahead and let's say I want to increment the value again, but this time I'm not using this number decimal. Let's go ahead and let's run this command. Let's go and query the document. You will see that the value has been incremented and it has been incremented to 0.3 and then some trailing zeros. And this is because this 0.1, it will have some imprecision, and that imprecision is also added to this 0.2. That's why you're seeing too many zeros here. There might be some imprecision also added here, but that is not being shown here. So I hope this point is also clear. All right. And also one more thing, these numbers, whether it is a floating point number or an integer number, these numbers can be used for filtering, sorting, etc. in your documents. Okay. So they will be used as normal numbers. So decimal gives us more precision over double. But remember that decimal takes more memory for storing the value than double. So always use double where precision is not required. It will save you some space. But if precision is important for some of the fields in your application, then you must go with decimal. Even though it comes with a price of utilizing more memory, but it will give you high precision. And decimal type is very useful when you want to do some scientific calculations or when you want to perform some calculation on some financial data. This is all from this lecture and from this section. In this section, we learned about number types in great details and how we can save numbers as integers or decimals from Mongo shell. If you have any questions from this lecture, then feel free to ask it. Thank you for listening and have a great day.